She was 18 years old and, in the quiet, administrative way that families can undo themselves, she was homeless. Lottie Ward had no plan, no prospects, and no one to turn to. Just a small canvas pack, the worn whittling knife her grandfather had left her, and a deed to a worthless piece of land. The land held nothing but scrub pine, rock, and a single, boarded-up well. But what nobody in her family knew, what nobody had cared to look for in over 50 years, was that sealed deep inside that dry well was a secret left by another forgotten woman, a secret that would give Lottie the one thing her own blood had denied her, a chance. So settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we tell the story of Lottie Ward and the inheritance that saved her. Lottie had grown up in a house of straight lines and quiet surfaces. Her father, a man who managed the town accounts, saw the world as a ledger of debts and assets, and his daughter, unfortunately, had always been filed under the former. Her mother, a woman worn thin by a life of silent compliance, moved through the rooms like a shadow, her only principle to avoid disturbance. It was not a house of cruelty, but of absence. There was food on the table, a clean bed, and clothes that fit, but there was no warmth, no slack, no room for the lovely, useless things that make a life. Lottie learned early to be self-contained, to move without a sound, and to expect nothing she had not earned with her own two hands. She was a ghost in her own home, a line item her father had not yet figured out how to balance. Her only refuge had been her maternal grandfather, a man named Thomas Mayhew. He had lived in a small workshop behind his own house, on the other side of town, a place that smelled of cedar shavings, linseed oil, and pipe tobacco. While her parents saw only burdens, Thomas saw capability. He never spoke down to her, not once. He had placed a tool in her hand when she was 6, a small block of soft pine, and showed her how to feel the grain, how to let the blade follow the wood's own intention. He taught her the names of things, the difference between a rip cut and a cross cut, the heft of a good framing hammer, the precise way to stack firewood so the air could move through it and keep it dry. He taught her that work was not a punishment, but a conversation between a person and the world. He showed her how to read the weather in the clouds and the ache in his own joints, how to mend a seam, how to set a clean stitch, how to listen to what a thing needed. Thomas had been a man of few words, but deep affections. He showed his love not in pronouncements, but in the steady, patient sharing of his craft. He taught her that the world was full of abandoned things, waiting for a pair of hands to see their worth again. A chair, with a broken leg, a dull axe head, a patch of sour ground. Most folks just see the break, he'd say, his voice a low rumble as he guided her hand with the draw knife. You learn to see the mend. The mend is where the strength is. He passed away when Lottie was 15, a quiet departure in his sleep, and the world of straight lines and silent surfaces closed in on her completely. Her parents disposed of his belongings with brisk efficiency, selling his tools for a fraction of their worth, and clearing out the workshop until it was just an empty box. But Lottie had managed to keep one thing, a small treasure she had slipped into her pocket during the clean-out. It was a small, perfectly carved wren, no bigger than her thumb, made from a piece of cherry wood. Its lines were so simple, so full of life, that she could feel the weight of the bird in her palm. It was the first thing he had ever taught her to carve, and his own finished version had been his gift to her. It was smooth from years of her carrying it, a small, solid piece of the only unconditional love she had ever known. She kept it in her pocket always, a secret anchor in a world that wanted her to drift away, and she learned the lesson of the mend, carrying it inside her like a quiet promise. She observed, she learned, and she waited, knowing that sooner or later, her column in her father's ledger would be closed out. She did not know when, but she knew it was coming, and she was determined to be ready, to see the mend in whatever was broken. The day came 2 weeks after her 18th birthday. It was a Tuesday in late autumn. The sky the color of slate and a chill wind rattling the window panes. There was no argument, no raised voice, no dramatic scene. Drama was an expense, and her father was a frugal man. He called her into his study after the meager evening meal. The room was just like him, orderly, severe, and smelling faintly of dry paper and ink. He was sitting behind his large oak desk, a stack of ledgers to his left, and a single sealed envelope to his right. He did not ask her to sit. He simply looked at her, his eyes clear and unclouded by any discernible emotion. "Lottie," he said, his voice as dry as the rustle of a page. "You are a woman now. You are of legal age." He pushed the envelope across the polished surface of the desk. "Your mother and I have provided for you, as was our duty. It is time for you to make your own way." She picked it up. It was heavy. She didn't need to open it to know what was inside. She could feel the stiff fold of paper, the cool, milled edges of a few coins. "There is $20 in cash," he continued, confirming her guess. "And the deed to the old Ward property, up in the hollow. It was your great-grandfather's original claim. It is of no value to us, but the title is clear. It is now yours. You are free to do with it as you see fit." The Ward property. She knew of it only from dismissive family mentions. A patch of useless, rocky hillside nobody had set foot on in 50 years, left to the family in a complicated inheritance. It was a piece of land so worthless that it wasn't even worth the trouble of selling. It was a final, neat accounting, a way of giving her something that was, in fact, nothing at all. He was not casting her out. He was balancing his books. Lottie stood there, the envelope in her hand, and simply nodded. She did not cry. She did not plead or argue. It would have been like arguing with a stone wall. What was the point? To beg for a warmth that was not there? To ask for a home from a man who only understood houses? She had learned from her grandfather that you could not carve against the grain. You would only break the wood. Her family was a piece of wood with a grain that ran away from her, and she would not break herself against it. She looked at her father one last time, at the neat part in his hair and the clean collar of his shirt, and saw a stranger. "Thank you," she said. The words were quiet, but they were not meek. They were the sound of a door closing, a page turning. She turned and walked out of the study, went up to her small, plain room, and began to pack. She did not have much: a change of clothes, a woolen blanket, a small tin pot, and the block of soap from her washstand. She wrapped the carved wren in a spare handkerchief and placed it carefully in the bottom of her canvas sack. Lastly, she retrieved the whittling knife her grandfather had given her, its wooden handle dark and smooth with age. She ran her thumb over the familiar steel. It was sharp. It was enough. Within the hour, she was standing at the front door, her sack over her shoulder. Her mother was there, polishing a silver candlestick, her back to the door. She did not turn around. "Goodbye, Mother," Lottie said. The polishing cloth stilled for a moment. "Be well, Charlotte," her mother murmured to the candlestick, and then the rubbing resumed. Lottie opened the door, stepped out into the cold autumn evening, and pulled it shut behind her. The click of the latch was the only sound. It was final. She was 18 years old, standing on a dark street, with $20, a knife, a blanket, and a deed to a piece of forgotten land. She was free. She did not look back. She walked through the familiar streets of the town, past the general store with its glowing windows, and the blacksmith shop, now dark and silent. The town felt like a place she was only visiting, a memory already fading behind her. She followed the main road as it turned to dirt and began to climb out of the small valley where the town was nestled. The air grew colder, sharper, smelling of pine and damp earth. The journey was not a flight. It was a measured, deliberate march. Each step was a choice, a confirmation of the quiet finality of her departure. She walked until the last lights of the town were swallowed by the hills, and then she kept walking, her eyes adjusted to the faint light of a crescent moon. She knew the general direction of the hollow, a day's walk north, and she had a good sense of the sun and the stars, another gift from her grandfather. He had taught her to navigate not by maps, which could be wrong, but by the land itself, the way moss favored the north side of a tree, the way the prevailing winds shaped the branches of the pines. The weight of the pack on her shoulders was a comfort, a solid, tangible reality. It was all she had in the world, and it was hers. She walked for hours, the rhythmic crunch of her boots on the gravel road, the only sound besides the wind in the trees. When she felt the first deep ache of fatigue in her legs, she turned off the road and found a sheltered spot in a copse of aspens. She didn't build a fire. She didn't want to draw attention, though there was likely no one for miles to see it. She unrolled her blanket, ate a piece of hard bread she had saved from her last meal, and lay down with her head on her pack. The ground was cold and hard, but the wool of the blanket was a familiar comfort. Above her, the stars were scattered across the black sky like spilled salt, brilliant and indifferent. She was not afraid. She felt a strange, quiet calm settle over her. For the first time in her life, there were no expectations, no silent judgments, no ledger to be balanced. There was only the ground beneath her, the sky above her, and the long road ahead. The next morning, she was awake before the sun, her body stiff but rested. She chewed on another piece of bread and set out again. The landscape grew wilder, the road dwindling to a pair of rutted tracks. The hills were steeper now, covered in dense forests of pine and fir. She passed an abandoned farmhouse, its roof caved in, and its windows like vacant eyes. She saw deer moving like ghosts through the trees, and heard the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. The world felt vast and empty and beautiful. By midday, she was walking along a ridge that overlooked a deep, narrow valley. This was the Hollow. It was a quiet place, a crease in the earth that the world had largely forgotten. A small creek, the Hollow Creek, ran along the bottom, its water dark and clear over a bed of stones. She followed the track as it descended into the valley, the air growing cooler and smelling of river water and wet rock. According to the deed, the Ward property was a 40-acre plot on the western slope, a place the locals had always called the Stone Acre for its poor, rocky soil. She found the old surveyor's marker, an iron stake driven into the ground beside a towering ponderosa pine, its bark scarred with a faded W. She had arrived. She stood at the edge of her inheritance and looked out over the land that was now hers. It was exactly as she'd imagined, a steep, unforgiving slope of land, thick with lodgepole pine and choked with underbrush. Boulders, big as wagons, jutted from the earth. It was no place for a farm, no place for a pasture. It was a place to be left alone. It was perfect. Lottie spent the rest of the afternoon walking the boundaries of her land, her feet sure on the uneven ground. She was not looking for fertile soil or good timber. She was simply getting the feel of the place, letting it settle into her. The land was steep and rugged, but it was also beautiful in its own wild way. The wind sawed through the pines with a sound like a distant ocean, and the air was clean and sharp. She found a small, level clearing not far from the creek, a place where a stand of old-growth pines offered some shelter from the wind. This, she decided, would be where she would make her camp. Near the center of the clearing, half overgrown with thorny bushes and wild raspberry canes, she found the well. It was not what she expected. It was not a simple hole in the ground, but a properly dug well, lined with heavy fitted stones and capped with a low wall of the same rock, about 2 feet high. The opening was covered with a thick, heavy lid made of 2 layers of weathered oak planks, nailed crosswise to each other for strength. The planks were gray and splintered with age, and the large, hand-wrought nails that held them down were rusted deep into the wood. Someone had taken great care to build this well, and someone had taken equal care to seal it. It was strange. Why dig such a substantial well on a piece of land this poor? And why seal it so permanently? It didn't seem to be a simple act of abandonment. It felt deliberate, final. She knelt and ran her hand over the rough wood of the lid. It was solid, unmoving. She tried to peer through the cracks, but it was dark as pitch inside. A faint, dry, earthy smell rose from it, the smell of undisturbed places. There was no scent of water, no dampness. It was a dry well. Her father had been right. The land was worthless. The well was useless. And yet, she felt a pull toward it, a sense of curiosity that was stronger than her disappointment. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind. Most folks just see the break. You learn to see the mend. This well was broken, abandoned, but there was something about its careful construction, its deliberate sealing, that felt less like a failure and more like a secret. She stood up and looked around the clearing, her well, her land. It was not much, but it was a start. She had a place to stand, and from that place, she could begin to build. That night, she made a small, careful fire, using the skills Thomas had taught her. She cooked a thin soup of foraged mushrooms and wild onions in her tin pot, and the simple warmth of it was the most satisfying meal she had ever eaten. She had $20, a blanket, and a dry well. It was more than she'd had the day before. The next morning, Lottie turned her full attention to the well. Her practical mind told her to focus on building a shelter, but her intuition, a sense honed by years of quiet observation, insisted that the well was the first order of business. She needed to know what was inside, or what wasn't. The lid was fastened with 4 enormous iron bolts at the corners. Their square heads rusted tight to the wood. She had no wrench, no tool for the job. She walked the perimeter of her land again, this time with a specific purpose. Near the creek bed, she found what she was looking for, a long, flat piece of granite that had flaked off a larger boulder. It was heavy, but she could manage it. She carried it back to the well and, using a smaller, sharper rock, began to chip away at one end, slowly and patiently shaping a crude but effective chisel. It was slow, painstaking work. Her hands were scraped and sore by the time she had a tool she could use. Using another heavy stone as a hammer, she set the point of her granite chisel against the rusted head of the first bolt and began to strike. The shock of the impact jarred her arms, and the sound was a dull thud. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, with a screech of tortured metal, the bolt head shifted, just a fraction of an inch. It was enough. Hope surged through her, a warm and unfamiliar feeling. She worked for hours, her rhythm steady and determined. Position the chisel, strike, reposition, strike again. The sun climbed high overhead, and sweat ran down her face. But she did not stop. One by one, the 4 bolts gave way, groaning in protest, as they were forced up from the wood they had held for decades. Finally, only the rusted nails held the planks in place. For this, she needed a lever. She found a sturdy branch of ironwood, and using a rock as a fulcrum, she wedged the end under the edge of the heavy lid and put her full weight on it. The old wood groaned. Splinters flew. With a final, agonizing crack, the nails tore free, and the heavy lid shifted, opening a dark gap. She heaved it aside. It fell to the ground with a heavy, final thud. Lottie knelt at the edge of the well and peered down into the darkness. A shaft of sunlight illuminated the inside. The stone lining was expertly laid, the stones fitted together without mortar. The shaft was perfectly circular and went down about 20 feet. And at the bottom, there was no water, there was no mud, there was only a floor of neatly laid flagstones. It was not a well at all. It was a hidden room, a stone cellar, dug into the earth, and in the very center of the flagstone floor was a single, flat-topped wooden chest, bound with iron straps. Her heart, which had been beating with the rhythm of her work, now hammered against her ribs with a different kind of energy. She had no rope. She looked around, her mind racing. The long roots of the pines that lined the clearing were thick and strong. She spent another hour with her knife, sawing through one of the thickest roots, then splitting it into thinner, more flexible strands. She braided them together, testing the strength of her makeshift rope every few feet. When it was long enough, she tied one end securely around the base of the pine tree and lowered the other into the shaft. She took a deep breath, gripped the rough rope, and began to lower herself into the cool, silent dark. The air was dry and still, smelling of stone dust and old, dry wood. Her feet touched the flagstone floor with a soft scuff. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The room was small, perhaps 8 feet across. The stone walls were cool and dry to the touch. The chest sat in the center, waiting. It was not locked. The lid was heavy, but it lifted easily on its iron hinges. She braced herself and pushed it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of dry straw, were three objects. The first was a stack of United States gold coins, double eagles, their surfaces gleaming in the dim light. She counted them slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. There were 50 of them, $1,000. It was a fortune, more money than she had ever imagined. The second object was a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age, and a small, heavy silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened the journal. The first page contained a neat, careful script. My name is Elspeth Ward. I was born in 1861, and I built this place with my own hands in the spring of 1888. If you are reading this, it means I am long gone, and you have found my savings. I hope you are in need of them. I hope you are family. Lottie's breath caught in her throat. She sat on the edge of the chest and began to read. My name is Elspeth Ward. I was born in 1861, and I built this place with my own hands in the spring of 1888. If you are reading this, it means I am long gone, and you have found my savings. I hope you are in need of them. I hope you are family, a daughter or granddaughter of my brother, though I suppose it doesn't matter who you are. What matters is that you had the grit to open this well. This land was my inheritance, just as it may now be yours. My brother, Robert, your great-grandfather perhaps, was a practical man. He saw this plot as worthless and urged me to sell it. But I saw the good stone and the straight pines, and I saw a place where a woman could be left alone. I never married. The man I was to marry died of fever, and after that, I found I preferred my own company. I worked as a seamstress in town, but I saved every penny I could. I used that money to hire a man to blast the rock, and then I dug this room myself, and I lined it with the stones from the hillside. It was my larder, my root cellar, my safe place. The well cap was to keep my savings safe from my brother, who believed a woman with money was a woman in trouble. The coins in this chest are the sum of my life's work. 50 double eagles, $1,000. It is not a king's ransom, but it is enough to build a life. Use it well. Buy good tools, sound lumber, and seed for a garden. Do not be beholden to any man who does not respect the work of your hands. The locket was my mother's. Inside is a picture of her, and a lock of my own hair. Keep it, or sell it, as you see fit. It is just a thing. Your life is what matters. I lived on this land for 30 years. I built a small cabin near the creek. It is likely gone now, returned to the earth. But the stones remain. I hope this place brings you the peace it brought me. I hope you build something strong here. Yours in hope, Elspeth Ward, October 1918. Lottie closed the journal, her hands shaking. She picked up the silver locket and opened it. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman with a kind, serious face. On the other, under a piece of clear crystal, was a small coil of reddish-brown hair. Elspeth Ward. A woman she had never known, a great-great-aunt, had reached across 50 years of silence and handed her a future. She had seen the same value in this land, the same promise. She had worked and saved and planned. And she had left this gift not for a specific person, but for a person of a specific character. Someone who would see a sealed well and have the patience and determination to open it. Lottie carefully rewrapped the journal and the locket and placed them in her pack. She stacked the gold coins and tied them securely in a piece of her spare shirt. She climbed back up the root rope into the bright sunlight, her mind reeling. The world looked different. The trees seemed taller. The sky seemed bluer. The land was no longer a place of survival. It was a place of possibility. She had work to do. The first step was a trip to Hollow Creek. She needed supplies, real tools, and provisions that would last. She hid her pack, with its precious contents, deep within the stone cellar, and covered the well opening with the heavy planks, weighing them down with rocks. It would be safe. She took 10 of the gold coins with her, tucking them into a small pouch she sewed into the lining of her trousers, and set off for the town, a 3-hour walk away. Hollow Creek was not much of a town. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a scattering of houses. It was a place where people worked hard and minded their own business. When Lottie walked into Henderson's general store, the man behind the counter, a stout fellow with a heavy gray mustache, looked her over with a neutral, appraising gaze. She was a stranger, and she was alone. "Help you?" he asked, his voice flat. Lottie did not waste words. "I need an axe head, a good one. A saw, a hammer, and nails. 10 pounds of flour, 5 of beans, salt, bacon, and a block of lard." Mr. Henderson's eyebrows rose slightly at the size of the order. He laid the items on the counter, his movements economical and precise. A beautiful, sharp felling axe head, a sturdy crosscut saw, a heavy claw hammer. "That'll be $7.50, he said, his eyes challenging her. He expected her to haggle, or to admit she couldn't pay. Lottie reached into her pocket and laid one of the gold double eagles on the counter. The coin shone against the dark, worn wood. It was worth $20. Mr. Henderson stared at the coin, then back at her. The challenge in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of respect. He picked it up, tested its weight in his palm, and then went to the cash drawer. He counted out her change in silver dollars and small coins. "Where you staying?" he asked. His tone changed. It was not idle curiosity. It was the question of a man who needed to know who his neighbors were. "The old Ward property," Lottie said simply. "Up the hollow." He nodded slowly, as if that explained everything. "That's hard country." "I know," Lottie said. She gathered her supplies, which now included a heavy canvas tarp and a good wool blanket that Mr. Henderson had recommended. As she was about to leave, he spoke again. "If you need that axe head handled, Silas Croft is the best. His smithy is at the end of the road. Tell him I sent you." "Thank you," Lottie said. She left the store and walked toward the sound of a hammer ringing on an anvil. She had money, she had tools, and she had a piece of advice. It was a beginning. The smithy was a dark, cavernous building that smelled of coal smoke, hot metal, and sweat. A tall, lean man in his late 50s, his face and arms smudged with soot, was hammering a glowing piece of iron into the shape of a hinge. This was Silas Croft. He glanced at Lottie as she entered, finished his piece with a few precise taps, and then plunged it into a quenching bucket with a loud hiss. He turned to her, wiping his hands on a leather apron. "What can I do for you?" His voice was a low rasp. Lottie presented the new axe head and the handle from her grandfather's old, broken axe, which she had brought with her. "Mr. Henderson sent me. I need this head set on this handle." Silas took the 2 pieces from her. He examined the axe head first, tapping it with his hammer, listening to the quality of the ring. He nodded in approval. "Good steel." Then he looked at the handle. It was old hickory, dark with age and oil from her grandfather's hands, but the grain was straight and true. He ran his calloused thumb along its length. "Good wood. Your father's?" "My grandfather's," Lottie said. Silas looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw not just a young woman alone, but someone who understood the value of good tools and the legacy they carried. "It'll be a fine axe," he said. "Come back tomorrow." He did not ask for payment up front. The exchange was one of craft, an understanding between people who knew the worth of things. Lottie returned to her land as the sun was setting, her new supplies heavy on her back but her spirit light. She now had the means to begin. The next day, she started clearing the site for her cabin, the small, level spot near the well. She worked with the new saw, its sharp teeth biting easily into the thick underbrush. The work was hard, but it was satisfying. Every swing of the brush hook, every pull of the saw, was an act of creation, of turning a wild piece of land into a place of purpose. She worked until her muscles ached and her hands were raw, and then she worked some more. In the evening, she returned to Hollow Creek to collect her axe. Silas Croft handed it to her over his anvil. The head was perfectly seated. The wood of the handle swelled with a small wooden wedge driven into the top, making the fit tight and permanent. It was balanced, beautiful, and deadly sharp. "That'll do the work," he said. "What's it owe you?" Lottie asked. 50 cents, he replied. She paid him and thanked him. As she turned to leave, he said, "The Gable woman saw you walking out this way. She worries. Don't be surprised if she comes checking on you." Lottie just nodded and left. She understood. In a place like this, community was not about friendship. It was about survival. People watched out for each other in quiet, practical ways. A few days later, as Lottie was felling the first of the small lodgepole pines she would use for her cabin walls, she proved Silas right. A woman appeared at the edge of the clearing, carrying a covered basket. She was in her 40s, with a warm, weathered face and kind eyes. "You must be the Ward girl," she said, her voice gentle. "I'm Mary Gable. I brought you some stew. A person can't live on beans and bacon alone." She handed Lottie the basket. Inside was a steaming bowl of rich beef stew and a thick slice of fresh bread. Lottie, who had been living on beans and bacon, was overwhelmed. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick. "It's no trouble," Mrs. Gable said, looking at the clearing, at the neatly stacked brush and the felled trees. "You're doing good work here." She didn't stay long. She just delivered her kindness and went on her way. But her visit was more than just a meal. It was an acceptance. Lottie was no longer just a stranger. She was the Ward girl, a part of the landscape, a neighbor. She ate the stew sitting on a stump, the best meal of her life, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the food. She was building more than a cabin. She was building a home. The work consumed her. Using the techniques her grandfather had taught her, she began to construct her cabin. It was small, only 12 feet by 10, but it was hers. She felled the trees, stripped the bark with her knife, and cut the notches in the logs for the corners. It was slow, physically demanding labor, but her body grew stronger, her hands tougher. She learned the personality of each log, the way the wood resisted the saw or yielded to the axe. She worked from sunup to sundown, fueled by Mrs. Gable's occasional stews and her own fierce determination. The walls rose slowly, one log at a time. She built a stone foundation, using the endless supply of rocks from her own land, and left openings for a small window and a door. The community continued its quiet support. Silas Croft stopped by one afternoon on his way back from a delivery, looked over her work with a critical eye, and left her a small bundle of hand-wrought hinges for her door, without a word. Mr. Henderson saved a small, unbroken pane of glass for her, from a broken window frame he was replacing, charging her only a dime. These were not acts of charity, but of respect. They saw the quality of her work, her tireless effort, and they added their own craft to hers. They were helping her build her house, and in doing so, they were weaving her into the fabric of the hollow. By the time the first snows of winter began to dust the high peaks, the cabin was complete. The roof was made of thick pine boards, covered with a layer of canvas, sealed with hot pine pitch. The walls were chinked with a mixture of mud and moss, making them tight against the wind. She built a small, efficient fireplace and chimney out of clay and river stones, a task that took her a full week of patient, careful work. The first fire she lit in it filled the small room with a flickering orange light and a comforting warmth. It was the most beautiful sight she had ever seen. The cabin was not just a shelter. It was a testament to her own strength and skill. Every log, every stone, was a piece of her own story. She had a home. Not a house with straight lines and silent surfaces, but a home, built with her own two hands on her own land. Her life settled into a rhythm dictated by the seasons. She spent the winter months indoors, carving small wooden figures from scraps of pine and hickory, a skill that came back to her as if she had never stopped. She carved birds and small animals, each one imbued with the same simple life as the wren her grandfather had made. When a traveling merchant passed through the hollow in the spring, she traded a dozen of her carvings for a small flock of chickens and a bag of seed potatoes. Mrs. Gable showed her how to plant a garden in the rocky soil, amending it with leaf mold and creek mud. Silas Croft taught her how to properly temper and sharpen her own tools. Mr. Henderson gave her credit at the store. They no longer called her the Ward girl. They called her Lottie. She was a part of the hollow now, as fixed and steady as the pines on the hillside. The well, her secret cellar, remained the heart of her homestead. It was her larder, where she kept her potatoes and preserved vegetables cool, and it was her bank, where the remainder of Elspeth's gold remained safely hidden. But it was more than that. It was a connection, a link, to the woman whose foresight and labor had made all of this possible. One evening, as the sun set behind the western ridge, casting long shadows across the valley, Lottie sat on the small porch she had added to her cabin. She held two objects in her palm. One was the cherrywood wren, its surface worn to a deep, silken patina by her own touch. The other was the silver locket, cool and heavy. She opened the locket and looked at the serious, kind face of Elspeth Ward, a woman she knew only through a few careful words and a legacy of stone and gold. She felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the money, but for the kinship, for the silent, powerful understanding that had passed between them across the years. Elspeth had seen the mend, and she had passed that vision on to Lottie. Lottie went inside and cleared a space on the rough wooden mantelpiece she had built above her hearth. She took the small wooden wren, the symbol of her grandfather's love and the skills he had given her, and placed it on one side. Then she took the silver locket, the symbol of Elspeth's hope and her inheritance of resilience, and placed it on the other. The two objects, one of wood and one of silver, from two people who had loved her without ever seeing her become the woman she was, sat together in the heart of her home. They were anchors, reminders of where she had come from and how she had arrived. She had come to this place with nothing but a memory and a broken piece of land. Now, she had a home, a livelihood, and a community. She had taken what was abandoned and made it whole. She had found the mend, and it was stronger than anything that had ever been broken. Lottie stood by the fire, its warmth on her face, and looked around the small, sturdy room. The firelight danced on the log walls, on the neat stack of firewood, on the simple wooden furniture she had built herself. It was a life made of substance, of tangible things, of work that mattered. She thought of her father and his ledgers, of a life measured in columns of profit and loss. He had seen her as a liability to be cleared, and in his cold accounting, he had given her the one asset he couldn't measure, a chance to build a life on her own terms. He had cast her out into the wilderness, but instead of being lost, she had found herself. She thought of Elspeth, another woman who had chosen the wilderness over a world that had too little room for her. Elspeth had dug her well, built her home, and hidden her hope in the dark, trusting that someone with the right kind of spirit would one day find it. Lottie felt as though she had not just inherited Elspeth's money, but her legacy. It was a legacy of quiet defiance, of seeing value where others saw waste, of building a life from the stones others had discarded. The wind howled outside, a familiar winter sound, but inside the cabin, it was still and warm. Her home was a fortress against the cold, both of the weather and of the world. She was no longer a ghost in someone else's house. She was the master of her own. Lottie Ward was 18 years old when her family sent her away with $20 to her name, and she had spent it all on tools and supplies to begin her life on a worthless plot of land. It was the best investment she ever made, for it was there, in the heart of what everyone else had abandoned, that she found not just a fortune, but a home, a purpose, and a connection to the quiet, resilient women who had come before her. What began as an act of rejection had become her foundation, and what was given as nothing had turned out to be everything. We hope Lottie's story of resilience and hidden strength resonated with you. If it did, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing this story with someone who might need it. And we'll leave you with a question to ponder in the comments below. What forgotten thing in your own life might just be waiting for a second look to reveal its true worth? Thank you for watching.